Okay, so in this exercise, our goal is to be able to classify a quadrilateral being given the 4 lengths of the sides and given the 4 slopes. When I say classify the quadrilateral, these are the options. It's either going to be a parallelogram, a trapezoid, or a kite. If it's parallelogram, we want to be as specific as possible. So if it's a rectangle or a rhombus, we're going to say so. Or even more specific still, if it's a square, we're going to say so. If it's a trapezoid, that's great, but is it an isosceles trapezoid? That's more specific. So we're going to classify, but we are going to try to be as specific as we possibly can. Notice that I've left this space here for an explanation. So you're not just going to write down the word, parallelogram or whatever. You're going to say why you think it is what it is. And mostly that's going to come down to the definition. If you're going to say it's a parallelogram, that's going to be because the opposite sides are parallel. If you're going to say that it's a trapezoid, that's going to be because it has exactly 1 pair of parallel sides. And if you're going to say it's a kite, you're going to say it's because it has 2 pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent, meaning right next to each other. But part of your explanation needs to be, look, we're trying to be as specific as possible. So say if you decide that the best classification is parallelogram. In some way, you have to explain to me why it's not a rectangle and it's not a rhombus. So if you say parallelogram, you have to say why you're not going more specific with it. If you say that the best classification is a trapezoid, you need to explain to me why it's not an isosceles trapezoid. All right? If you decide it's a kite, you don't have to say why it's not something else. A kite, there is nothing more specific than a kite. But if you say that you're going to classify your shape as a rectangle, you have to say why it's not a square, because a square would be more specific. Same thing with a rhombus. If you go with rhombus, in some way you have to show me why it's not a square. So keep that in your mind and I'll show you what I mean. Alright, so as we look at this, these distances and these slopes, please understand that we're talking about quadrilateral PQRS. Okay, so here is some random quadrilateral and I can call it PQRS. So we really should not have to draw the picture, but I'm just going to do it to make sure that you understand what we're dealing with. So we're given these lengths. So if I make a diagram of my distances, the PQ is 3 radical 2, so that would be like this. QR is radical 10. RS is also radical 10. And PS is 3 radical 10. Now, if you're having any trouble with this concept at all, I encourage you to make a diagram like I just did. Now, keep in mind, I don't know ahead of time if this is a trapezoid or a parallelogram or square or anything. So I'm just making the diagram as best I can, but I have to be flexible. Now, so those are the lengths. Also keep in mind the slopes. I'll do that in different color. I'll do that in green. So side PQ, this side has slope 1. QR has slope 1/3. RS has slope -1/3. And PS has slope 1/3. Okay, so I have the lengths of all the sides and I have the slopes of all the sides. Now, it's time to decide, is this a parallelogram, a trapezoid, or a kite? Let's start with parallelogram. If this is a parallelogram, then opposite sides should be congruent. Also, both pairs of opposite sides should be parallel. Let's start with congruent. I have 3 radical 2 and radical 10. These opposite sides are not congruent. I have radical 10 and 3 radical 10. The opposite sides are not congruent. For that reason, I can go ahead and conclude that this shape is not a parallelogram, which automatically means it's not a rectangle, a rhombus, or a square. Okay, so it's definitely not a parallelogram. Equally, I could have looked at the slopes. If this is a parallelogram, opposite slopes should be the same, because that's what it means to be parallel. If the lines are parallel, the slopes will be equal. And if I were to look at these slopes, PS and QR, look, these are the same. That means these lines are parallel. Okay, QR is parallel to PS. But if I look at the other lines, PQ and SR, 1 and -1/3, these are not the same. So these lines are not parallel. So fine, it's not a parallelogram. Now, before I go on to classifying, let me make this clear to you. It's easy to see because I drew it all out in a diagram. But please understand, if I want to talk about opposite sides, on the chart, I don't really need a diagram. I know that opposite sides will be, skip a row, and you're looking at opposite sides. So, for example, PQ and RS are opposite sides. As long as you make the letters in order, you know, PQ, QR, RS, and then PS, this will work. So PQ and RS are opposite sides. I can see that they're not congruent. In the same way, QR and PS, if you skip a row, you're talking about opposite sides. So these are opposite sides, and again, they are not congruent. Okay, so fine, it's not a parallelogram. But is it a trapezoid? That's what I look to next. What is the definition of a trapezoid? Well, the definition of a trapezoid is that it has exactly one pair of parallel sides. One pair of parallel sides. Looking at our chart, does this have one pair of parallel sides? Well, yes, it does. See the 1/3 and the 1/3? These are parallel sides. The other pair is not parallel, 1 and -1/3. So I already marked that before. QR and PS are parallel, one pair of parallel sides. So right there, I know that this is a trapezoid. So that means it's not a kite. So the only possibilities are either I'm going to say it's a trapezoid, or I'm going to be more specific and say it's an isosceles trapezoid. Now, what's the difference between a regular trapezoid and an isosceles trapezoid? Alright, remember that in a regular trapezoid, which is something like maybe like this, so here are my one pair of parallel sides. But notice the legs, like this is a leg and this is a leg over here. In a regular trapezoid, the legs do not have to be the same. But if it's going to be an isosceles trapezoid, and here's a picture of an isosceles trapezoid. In an isosceles trapezoid, these legs would have to be congruent. So these are bases, base, base, and these are legs, leg, leg. If it's isosceles, then the legs have to be congruent. So looking back at this problem, notice which sides are the bases. All right, the parallel sides are the bases. So this is a base, and this is a base. Those are parallel. That means these are the legs. That's a leg, and this is a leg. 3 radical 2 and radical 10. Well, the legs are not congruent. 3 radical 2, radical 10, they're not the same. So this is not isosceles because of that. Now, so here's what I need you to do. Because in this space, you're supposed to write an explanation. This is not here for us, to draw a diagram. Okay, so it's time to do our explanation. We have decided that this is a trapezoid, so just write this down. So here's my explanation. This is a trapezoid because it has exactly one pair of parallel sides. Now remember my diagram. If I say it's a trapezoid and I stop there, I have to say why it's not isosceles. So I have a choice. I can either write another sentence explaining why it's not isosceles, or I can just mark it on the chart. So if I wrote it, it would look like this. I would add another sentence saying, it is not isosceles because the legs are not congruent. So you can just write that statement, or you can just mark that on the chart. Okay, look. Notice the sides that were parallel. See the 1/3 and the 1/3? These are the sides that are parallel. So these were the bases. So this is a base, and this is a base. You can mark that right on your chart. It'll make you feel better. Go ahead. If these are the bases, that means these are the legs. Like PQ is a leg, and RS is a leg. So you can write this sentence like this, or you can just mark it on your picture, okay, on your chart. If I circle these, then I can simply write not isosceles. Okay? And that'll let me know that you see that it's not isosceles because the legs are not congruent. It's just a shorter way of showing me the information. Okay? Let's go ahead and look at number 2. Okay, looking at number 2. Alright, I've cut and pasted number 2 over here on my diagram. First I ask myself, is it a parallelogram, trapezoid, or a kite? Let's start with parallelogram. If it's a parallelogram, opposite sides will be congruent. For example, I know that these are opposite sides because I'm skipping a row. If this is a parallelogram, then these should be congruent. And they're not congruent, so I know this is not a parallelogram. So right away, I cross this out. So I move on to trapezoid. If this is a trapezoid, the definition of a trapezoid is that there should be exactly one pair of parallel sides. All right, when I'm talking parallel, I'm looking at the slopes and seeing if any are the same. 1/3, -1/3, 3, -3. None of these are the same. That means none of the sides are parallel. So that means it's not a trapezoid. The only thing left is a kite. Now, the definition of a kite says that there should be 2 pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. Consecutive means right next to each other. So here's a pair of consecutive sides. They are congruent. Here's another pair of consecutive sides. They are also congruent. Notice that a kite doesn't have any parallel lines at all. So this is a kite. And in our explanation, we would just say, this is a kite because. This is a kite because it has two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. In other words, just mention the definition of a kite in your explanation. Now, looking back at my diagram, notice that a kite, there is nothing more specific. Like for a trapezoid, could be isosceles. That's more specific. If it's a parallelogram, it could be a rectangle or a square, or it could be a rhombus. All of these would be more specific than parallelogram. But a kite is just a kite. There's no more specific kind of kite. So you don't have to say anything about that, but it's not something else. So you can just say that it's a kite and be done with it. So that's it. That's the answer to number 2, and that's why. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 3. If you've just been copying off of me watching the video, please pause the video right now and try to do number 3 on your own. Please pause the video now. All right, number 3 looks like this. Again, looking back at the diagram, and here's number 3 cut and pasted over here. There are 3 possibilities. This is either a parallelogram, a trapezoid, or a kite. So start by just deciding which one of these 3 situations we are in. If it is a parallelogram, opposite sides will be congruent, and opposite sides will be parallel. So, for example, these are opposite sides. Radical 10, opposite sides are congruent. 3 and 3, these opposite sides are parallel. So far, that's only one pair. Here's the other pair of opposite sides, QR and PS. These blue ones are opposite sides. Radical 10, opposite sides are congruent. -3, -3, opposite sides are parallel. So this is definitely a parallelogram, which means it is not a trapezoid and it is not a kite. All right, so the only question is, can we get more specific than that? Let's see, let me not erase yet. So it's a parallelogram, fine. But can I be more specific and call it a rectangle or a rhombus? Let's start with rhombus because that's the most obvious. What's the definition of a rhombus? The definition of a rhombus is that it should have 4 congruent sides. All right? I should be looking at the distances, not the slopes. Radical 10, radical 10, radical 10, radical 10. It has 4 congruent sides. So this is definitely a rhombus. Okay? Now the only question is, can I get even more specific? So I'm done with parallelogram. I'm not going to say the word parallelogram. I'm at rhombus now. So the only question is, can I be even more specific and call it a square? Well, if it's a square, it's going to be a square because in addition to having 4 congruent sides, it better also have 4 90-degree angles. All right, a square is a rectangle and a rhombus. So a square has to have 4 congruent sides. Yes, just like because it's a rhombus. But it also has to have 4 right angles. Okay, so here's the last thing that you need to understand. When we're talking about right angles, we're talking about 90 degrees. Okay? So if I'm talking about right angles, 4 right angles form 90 degrees. That means they are perpendicular. All right? If they're perpendicular, their slopes should be opposite and reciprocal. So for example, if one of them has a slope of 3, like up 3 over 1, the other line or segment should have slope negative 1/3. Opposite sign, that's why the negative, and then 1/3, that's reciprocal. 3 over 1 becomes 1 over 3. Now, if this is going to be a square, it has to have 4 right angles. So it would have to have opposite and reciprocal slopes as I go along. But is that what is happening? I have my 4 congruent sides already, so it's a rhombus. But when I look at these slopes, all right, look at these consecutive slopes. All right, PQ and QR. These two consecutive slopes should be opposite and reciprocal if it's a square. They are opposite, one positive, one negative. They're opposite in sign, but they're not reciprocal. You know, if this were reciprocal, it would be like negative 1/3. Okay, but that's not what it is. So, for that reason, these are not perpendicular. They are not 90-degree angles. So this is not a square. Okay? So that means I will stay with rhombus. My choice for this one is rhombus. Okay, now let's go back with our explanation. So we're going to go with rhombus on this one. Now in your explanation, this is what you would put. Mention the definition of a rhombus. It is a rhombus because it has 4 congruent sides. That's the definition of a rhombus. So in your explanation, the easiest thing to do is just mention that definition. Now, there is something more specific than a rhombus. So if we're not going to go there, we have to say why we're not going more specific with it. So the thing that is more specific than a rhombus is a square. So we have to go ahead and say why it's not a square. So your choices are, you can either write out in words that it's not a square because it does not have 4 right angles, but you need to say something about these slopes over here. So your choice is, you can write it out in words like I just did and explain why it's not a square. It is not a square because the sides are not perpendicular. The slopes are not reciprocal. Remember, because if it's going to be 90 degrees, that means perpendicular. Okay, if it's going to be 90 degrees, a square has 4 right angles. So all the sides should be perpendicular. So they should have been opposite and reciprocal. So either you can write it out in words, or instead you can just make a note on your chart. So you could just circle these and put a little side note that says not a square. And now if you're circling these two slopes and you're saying it's not a square, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you mean because they're not reciprocal. Alright, but it's your choice if you want to write it out in words or if you want to say what it's not by marking it on your chart. Alright, so those are 3 examples of how you would classify a quadrilateral based on the lengths of the sides and the slopes which you are given. Please remember that your process should be start by deciding whether it's a parallelogram, trapezoid, or a kite. If it's a parallelogram, the opposite sides should be congruent and parallel. If it's a trapezoid, there should be only one pair of parallel sides. If it's a kite, there shouldn't be any parallel sides, and instead we should see two pairs of consecutive sides congruent, meaning two pairs of congruent sides right next to each other on the chart. If it does turn out to be a parallelogram, obviously check and see if it's a rectangle or a rhombus. If it's a rectangle, you'll know it because the slopes should be opposite and reciprocal, like 3 and -1/3. If it's a rhombus, it'll be obvious because all of the sides will be the same. If it's a rectangle or rhombus, you must say if it's a square. Alright, again, if it's a square, it should have 90-degree angles, so this slope should be opposite and reciprocal. And finally, if you go with something where there is a more specific option, like if you choose parallelogram, don't forget that you have to indicate why it is not a rectangle. If you choose rectangle, you have to indicate why it is not a square. Actually, if you say parallelogram, you have two things. You have to say why it's not a rectangle, and you also have to say why it's not a rhombus. If you choose rhombus, you have to say why it's not a square. If you choose trapezoid, just regular trapezoid, you have to say why it's not isosceles. If you choose kite, you don't have to explain why it's not something else. A kite is just a kite.